Okay, moving into Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, in a lot of ways, you can see this is almost like a continuation of South Asia. And when you think about it, it sort of makes sense. You're talking about basically a contiguous area there. But the two big players really are the following. Sorry, I had to switch over to the map. To a large extent, Southeast Asia has sort of been under the umbrella or under the shadow, might be the best way to phrase it, of China. The massive population, massive resources, massive sort of technology that China represented right into, say, the 1700s really made it the huge player in this region. And what you find is to China, this sort of becomes almost a semi-colonial area. Not so much that ends offshore. The Chinese have never been particularly interested in putting around on the water till last 10 years. For most of their history. But the land areas, especially sharing the border with what's now southern Chinese border, have always been a massive interest to the Chinese, both in the destabilizing sense that movements from aggressive populations here could destabilize South China, and then of course then destabilize Chinese government. But more mainly just the idea that when China burns its way through a series of say resources, most famously maybe being sandalwood, that you go and you look for those replaceable resources in basically the mainland part of Southeast Asia. So China has traditionally seen Southeast Asia as its backyard, you might think, and tends to pretty much treat it that way. So China historically has been pretty aggressive about other folks sort of stepping into this region. The other player, which the folks to the western side have to deal with, has been your various Indian states. But again, as with the Chinese, these tended to not be maritime. And so the interesting thing is, despite the fact that you've got, for much of the year, very easy movement of ships and boats throughout this entire region, there was very little interest in doing this by the large political entities that were various states in India and or various Chinese empires. What you find ironically is from about 500, 600, 700 AD, and probably actually a lot earlier, we just don't have the data for it, is what you find is folks over here in what we call, we're looking at as West Asia, who are famous for sailing and famous for trade, basically become the dominant players in the trade all the way through this entire region over to the Philippines, Indonesia, and even to a certain extent, the western part of New Guinea. And you most famously see this if you ever read the Sinbad stories from the Arabian Nights. Those are actually in large part pretty accurate sailing directions for different parts of the trade empire that the Arabs were working their way through and sort of in control of, and pretty much had a monopoly on it for, maybe almost 800 or 900 years. Eventually what happens is the Europeans start to grow. And of course, the Europeans and the Arabs are fighting over this region in general anyways. The Portuguese, sort of the light bulb goes off. The Portuguese figure out how to get around, especially Africa. And what they do is they basically then swallow up the Arab trade and basically cut the Arabs out of the game. The Dutch follow and then cut the Portuguese pretty much out of the game. And then, of course, the British and the French come and cut the Dutch pretty much out of the game. So in this context, with all these folks coming across here, basically, if you want to think of it this way, let's move this down too. What you've got is folks in this region are using ships as a way to move goods from Asia, specifically China, also India, and basically move them in the Mediterranean, into the Mediterranean. And then what happens is the development of colonialism, the European concept, is the European powers and in Europe deciding that they want to not share this with the Arab trade networks. And so what they do is they basically take them over. This becomes the Portuguese, this becomes the Dutch East India Company, the precursor to the British East India Company that we're looking at earlier. And then what happens, so is by the 1700s, the Portuguese, Dutch, British, et cetera, and everyone and his brother is coming into and basically taking over this maritime trade. And the control of the maritime trade is really what drives European interest in Southeast Asia. But even in that situation, if you visualize a European sailing vessel coming across around Africa, coming this way, Trade with India is pretty straightforward. If you want to get to China, however, if you notice, you got to thread your way through this enormous nightmare of islands. And of course, we zoom in here, the number of islands gets even greater. It's an area that's famous for shipwrecks because there's a lot of uncharted reefs. There's a lot of, basically everything that can do damage to a ship. There's a bunch of it floating around here. And so the end result is for the Europeans, Southeast Asia is more like a speed bump. It's getting in the way of getting to China. It's getting in the way of making an oodle amount of money off of the China trade. And so again, you have to remember this entire concept again is monetary, it's financial. So to the Europeans, there was very little interest in Southeast Asia. The type of products you had here, or at least initially, weren't really of interest to the Europeans. It was sort of like, okay, you'd set up shop here, for example, the British set up Singapore to control the straits to basically get into the South China Sea to get to your China trade. And in fact, a lot of the China trade very early on ends up going basically from here across the Pacific, because it's easier than, going this way across the Atlantic and down around Africa than up to Europe. So it's actually easier to go across the Pacific and then across the Atlantic for a lot of folks. So Southeast Asia, initially is sort of like not on the charts. It's sort of a not particularly attractive area for outside interest. Now, for the folks that live there, it's a very, very complex area. And as sort of, with sort of the eastern part of India, if we zoom in here, it sort of breaks down into two obvious parts. One is, basically the land or mainland part of Southeast Asia, highly mountainous, as with China driven and India driven by rivers, in the sense that you have rivers, most famously the Mekong, coming through here. And so rivers become the mode of access through this region. Rivers have floodplains around them and provide the majority population. But to even a greater extent than China, and actually more like India, which you'll find is a large part of your populations are coastal. Now, when you move into the island part of this, you notice that all of a sudden the game changes tremendously. Now what you're talking about is maritime movement. And again, because of the historic relationships with China, India, and then later the Europeans, this area is an area that very rarely ends up with large empires or large political entities. And again, even though individuals, spend a lot of their time out fishing and putting around here, it's especially in a smaller boat, it's actually a fairly safe place to do your business most of the time. It's larger ships that end up in trouble. What you don't find is a lot of sort of economic transactions or movement of goods and resources through this area. It's always been sort of a puzzle because there's a lot of resources and there's very large populations, especially Indonesia. So you would think that there would have been a large maritime system, at least equivalent, if not larger, than you find in Europe, but you don't. In part, I suspect that's due to the fact that we're in the tropics, which just means a lot of this area is not as accessible, I suppose is a good way to put it. And the second is if you have the rivers and the mountain systems that basically dominate the mainland part, what you find here is, again, you have the same phenomena. A large, basically, if you visualize this entire area is basically flooded plains. As the sea level's risen over the last 10, 15,000 years, about 300 feet. This was originally all connected to Southeast Asia, the land part. And basically it's became flooded, and these have now become islands. And so what you find is the biota for most of Southeast Asia is the same, whether you're standing in Sarawak or Sumatra or something like that, or if you're standing in, say, Cambodia or south part of Vietnam. It's very, very similar. And so what you get is the main other dominant factor in this region is the same one we saw with this area, and this is the monsoon. So again, what you have is seasonal rains that put down an enormous amount of water, and then basically very little, if any, water for the rest of the year. And again, because you're in a tropical zone, you're talking about a lot of water. And so for whatever set of reasons, you don't find political entities setting up shop that actually rule this area or control it, or especially control maritime trade, which, if you think about it, is sort of odd, because given the fact these are largely maritime populations in a lot of here, you thought that you would think that they would control trade to, say, south part of China, especially Taiwan or Hainan here, or maybe the eastern part of India, but it doesn't seem to have ever happened. Most of these populations tend to have sort of stayed where they were. And other folks were the ones that did the trade. Again, occasionally the Chinese would, Chinese were always trying to grab the resources here, but again, they weren't really very maritime oriented, and even less so the Indians. So the odd thing is what you have is a very resource-rich part of the world, very large populations, but not a lot of movement. And the river mountain systems here, your mountain systems through here, and your monsoon seasonality might be part of that. But once the Europeans come into this area, everything just sort of goes boom. So it's one of those sort of puzzles. The other thing this area is probably most famous for is the fact that what you're on here is basically your crash plate, if you would, between different plates, the Pacific plates, the Indian plate, the Asian plate. So this area is one of the most volcanically active, tectonically active in the world. Indonesia alone has, I think it's over 100 active volcanoes. Papua New Guinea, I know, has got at least 35. Not so much the mainland part, but your island part of the Philippines has at least 30 or 40 that I can think of. So what you find throughout this entire region is incredibly active volcanically. Now, this wouldn't really have anything to do with maritime issues. So again, I'm not really sure why this area was sort of, for lack of a better term, was sort of sedentary. But nonetheless, even though it's very resource rich, it really doesn't, in terms of the physical geography, given the fact that it's dominated not only by water, but most of this water is actually fairly accessible in the sense that you're not talking high seas, you're not talking, massive amount of storms during a lot of the year. You just don't see the movement of goods and resources and people that you would sort of think you might throughout a lot of this region.